forgot that. In my spare time. I have prodigious amounts of free time. I'll just start using that instead.
You don't seem busy.
No, not at all.
Never.
What you talking about? It's a travesty. So anyway, how you guys doing? You all right? Quiz is okay for this week? 1 or 2, or maybe 0. Depends on how your week went.
No,
No, that's okay.
the second one, the
What was the second one?
The
T-test?
T-
Wasn't super clear?
Well, I was a little confused about, because you said you wanted to know the amount below.
If it was significantly below whatever it was supposed to be.
Significantly below, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I just.
So I'm giving you the sign.
I just got a little lost in there.
That's okay. What I'm trying to do, see, thank you for asking that, Chris. I appreciate that. So what I do on the quizzes that I'm giving you is different than what we do in class. In class, what we do is we develop our hypotheses together. We look at data and then say, what does it look like? What looks like what happened? Did it go down? Did it go up? Did it just change? We can't really tell. On the quizzes, I can't rely on that because you guys need to know what to test on the quiz, right? So what I wanted you to do there was, here's a bunch of numbers. Does it look like those are below the volume it should be? If so, we have to recalibrate. So your job was just to test the average
Right.
volume and see if that average was below whatever the stated amount was. That's all.
Well,
But don't-
But what's considered significant? I mean,
The p-value.
well, yeah, but.
Thank you for asking this. Thank you, Chris, for asking this. I got another email from another student in class that said the same thing. She did the quiz for last week, the New York Times quiz, the one with the yellow and blue circles. I'm not sure, very few of you did that one, that's okay. But the question was, did you score significantly higher than 75%? The student's response was, I did. I scored 18 out of 20, which was 80%. Am I doing that right? No, that's 90%. So her claim was, to me, that was significant. And I'm like, no, you can't say that. You can't say, to me, that's significant. It's, does the test say it's significant? Our anecdotal belief that something has changed is irrelevant. That's our gut, right? Our gut saying something is higher or louder or hotter or cheaper is irrelevant. It's, does the statistics say? Do the statistical test? What's the decision we have to look at to make our decision whether something is higher or lower or changed? The p-value. So, Chris, you have to calculate the p-value each time. I know it's way down here in numbers 7 and 8 on all these quizzes, but that's what tells you if something has changed or not. So you don't have to worry about whether you think it's significant or not, because what you think is irrelevant and what I think is irrelevant. What the test says is relevant. That takes all the guesswork out. All the subjectivity gets removed, and you're left with just a simple numerical calculation.
Well, the p-value I got was 0.5571.
That's a huge p-value, isn't it? That's way above 5%, which means everything's fine. That's all.
Everything's fine?
Yes, which we were trying to see if it was below 12.1 to get the machine recalibrated.
Well, yeah. But
That p-value tells me, no, it's not below 12.1%.
55% is below, isn't it?
Below 5%?
Well, okay.
You're confused. Okay, time out. You're confusing the parameter you're studying
Right.
with the probability of disagreement. The p-value measures probability of disagreement. You have to think back now about 2 or 3 weeks to what a p-value is. A p-value checks, here's the data we got, and here's the null hypothesis we were expecting. The null hypothesis for that one was the machine is fine, right? It doesn't need to be recalibrated because the average is either 12.1 ounces or higher, or 12 ounces, whatever it was. Your data came back with a p-value of 55%. That's very high, yes? That's above 5%. That means the data you got agrees with the null hypothesis. That means the machine doesn't have to be recalibrated.
Okay, okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Good. It has that number, 55%, has nothing to do with the number 12. They're completely different. I mean, one's fluid ounces and one has no unit. But that 55% tells you that your data and your assumed null agree with each other. The p-values that are below 5%, that's when we sit back and go, wait a minute, something must have changed. So if you had gotten a p-value of, say, 0.005, for example, which is way below 5%, then you would have said, I believe the research hypothesis now, which is that the machine does need to be recalibrated. Is that fair?
Yeah, so like the CDC one was, the p-value was the flu vaccine.
The flu vaccine, thank you.
Something like 0.0019.
Boom.
So that was Yeah.
that means we got significant, and that means the flu vaccine was working, right? Because the assumption is that the flu vaccine is not working. We got data to the contrary.
Right.
Good. I'm glad I did that. I didn't realize I had done that on these quizzes. One was small, one was big. I had forgotten I had done that. Good. Very good. Thank you for that question. Those are very, very good. And the reason I like it so much.
Well, I would have called you last night, but I didn't have your phone number.
That's okay. I wouldn't have gotten it last night anyway. I go to bed at like 8 because I get plenty of rest all the time. I just get up at 4. But the thing is that I love that you're bringing it up because every test we do from now, we got about 25% of the term left. It's kind of hard to think about that. We got today, we got 4 more days. Actually, no, we don't. I lied. We got next Tuesday and 2 more days. All we're going to be doing is interpreting p-values. And what that does is it takes the subjectivity out. It's not whether you or I think something is significant. What you or I think is completely irrelevant, unless you're doing a calculation in your head. That's the trick, right? Our gut, what we do is we take data and we look at the data and we go, it looks like it's lower, right? It looks like it's lower. Let's test it to see if our gut is actually in sync with rigorous statistical analysis. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. When you guys look at the last exam, I posted that for week 11, I mentioned this a couple times to you guys. The AHA exam I took, the American Heart Association CPR class or AED class I took, I had a gut feeling about the exam. I thought it didn't look quite right. So I did a statistical test on it. Now, as it turns out, there was no test available to do, so I made one up. Now, you might think, like, you made a test up, how is that even valid? Take a look, you'll see how it's valid. It's completely valid. I was actually pretty proud of it. I shared it with my buddy working on his PhD down in Berkeley. He's like, dude, smarty pants. Thank you. But the idea is I had a gut feeling, and then I tested my gut feeling. That's what you're doing in these. You're testing those gut feelings. But on the quizzes, the difference is you guys might not have a gut feeling, so I'm giving you the gut feeling to you. Does it look like it's too low? For next week, I've got a couple. I got to make one for you guys. I got to go find some more recent data for a t-test. I want to give you a t-test and what's called a matched pair t-test. That's what we're going to be doing today. It's called a matched pair t-test. It's under the umbrella of a t-test, but I think they're more fun. I think they're more fun. They're also, I think, more realistic. I just got a phone call, I think I told you guys, from a colleague in the HHP department that needs to crunch numbers for her. She's studying 2 hormones under different levels of exercise, and she wanted to do an ANOVA. I'm like, I think a t-test will do just fine. She said, what's a t-test? I'm like, oh, welcome to the beautiful world of t-testing. And it has to be a matched pair t-test. And you'll see the difference between a matched pair and just a regular little t-test by the end of today. But this is always what makes our decisions for us. Cool? Thank you for that question, Chris. That was a really, really good one.
But these were Z-tests because the data points were more than 30, right?
What? Wait, let's talk about for the soda?
Yeah.
Make it, you can run a Z-test. There's nothing wrong with running a Z-test. I always run t-tests because you're testing an average. See, don't worry about number of data points. All right? Don't worry about that as far as which test. Are you testing a proportion or an average? Worry about that. If you're testing a proportion, use Z. If you're testing an average, use T. That keeps it simple for you. Because if you go, if bigger than 30, I can use Z. You're correct in saying that. You can. But why not just always use T? Because it'll always work. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Hopefully, I'm trying to streamline the process as far as which decision to make. If you've identified, that's why I made the templates like they are too. Which variable are you testing? As soon as you answer this first question, you know what test you're going to run. If it's P, it's Z. If it's mu, it's a T. Boom, done. Is that cool? Excellent. Good, and great questions. Because you're getting, once again, to the heart of what we're talking about in here. Everything we do mechanically is a foregone conclusion, honestly. Once you have your data, the p-value is a consequence of that data. So it's important to know what you're doing with the data to make sure you're doing the right thing to that. Cool? Mm-hmm. Excellent. Other questions? Those are such good questions. Cool? Maybe-ish. Maybe you have some more questions by today. That's okay too. That's okay today. So we're back to the data sheets now. We were speaking at the end of the day on commercial volume last time. Commercial volume. And some of you expressed concern that commercials were too loud. That's awesome. The FCC apparently believes so. They thought they made a stupid little biased sampling device to measure that for you as well. So what I was able to do was to crack open some old data. I haven't gotten any newer data than this. This is from a Texas study. This predates this law, unfortunately. But we went ahead and gathered this data from about, I don't know, 25, maybe 30, maybe not even that many, 25. So commercials following shows. So here's our data Oh, it's on page 2, Elizabeth. It's going to be probably next page.
Two of them.
There you go, up there. Yeah. So you're on top of page 2 of the data sheet. We're going to start rocketing through this over the next couple of days because now that we understand hypothesis, at least the basics of how the tests work, we can just keep changing the attack of the data. So what's the first thing that jumps out at you when you see this data presented to you? How is it different than the other data we've played with? Like, for example, yesterday we did the speed limits on the Archie-Briggs. Chris mentioned the quiz from today, which was the soda volumes. Okay, how is this data list different? What is different about the presentation of this?
Each specific number set are compared instead of.
Aha! Instead of the whole, yes, Elizabeth, you've nailed it. So what you've got is you've got an umbrella now. We've been talking about t-testing, which is fantastic, for averages. Okay, that's the overriding umbrella we've been looking at. Up till now, all the data sets we've played with up till now all dealt with a single data set. Here's a bunch of volumes of 12-ounce soda. Here are a bunch of speeds from cars on Archie-Briggs Road. Here are a bunch of measurements that you guys call 3 inches. All of those are one single thing measured one time, yes? One single thing measured one time. Now, a bunch of times, I mean, we have a sample size, but it's still one type of measurement repeatedly, and then we group it into one big data set. Some of you might be looking at the speed limits and saying, wait a minute, that's actually 2, isn't it? Because there's an X and a Y. Remember, the other column is a frequency of the X's, so it's all just X's. As a subcategory of t-testing, though, and it's actually technically still a single data set, and you'll see why momentarily, you've got what are called matched pair tests. These are some of my favorite, and you guys have already experienced these in your lives, believe it or not. Believe it or not, you've experienced this. Many types are called pre-post tests. Ever heard of something like that? Yeah, okay, good. Yes. You measure something, then you do something, and then you measure it again. I jokingly refer to the one I'm still trying to find data for, which is that energy bracelet study. I'm still trying to wait for that data to come available for me to use. How do people jump with an energy bracelet on versus without an energy bracelet on? These are also sometimes called A/B tests. A/B tests. Whatever they're called, and they probably are called other things too that I can't think of right now. Whatever they're called, they contain 2 data sets that are dependent upon each other. Whatever they're called, whether it's a pre-post, whether it's an A/B, whatever they are, they contain 2 data sets that are dependent on each other, whatever they are. Later on, you're going to see the stopwatch test, the dependence. Sometimes you'll test reaction time in your dominant hand versus your non-dominant hand. Well, those 2 times are dependent on the fact that they're both connected to the same brain. So you can't treat them as independent data sets. They're 2 dependent data sets. Okay? The one we're about to look at are the commercials and the TV shows that immediately precede the commercials. The dependence is a little bit subtle here, but the dependence is just for the fact that the commercial is referential in volume to the show that was just playing before it. We can't just look at the average volume of the TV shows and the average volume of the commercials, because that loses the fact that the commercial is dependent on the show that came before it. We have to not look at this data like this. We have to look at this data like this. Does that make sense? Hopefully that does. If there is a dependence in the data sets, you can't ignore that dependence. It would be like in 243, calling things independent when they're in fact dependent. Well, you can't do that. That's how people go to jail unnecessarily. Sally Clark's a perfect example. You guys talked about Sally Clark with Donna, I think, in 243. The assumption of independence goes to the courts sometimes incorrectly. Things aren't independent sometimes. Very often there is a dependence. I'm reminded of a kid that came to me. Did I tell you about the kid who asked me to prove that God exists through mathematics? Did I ever tell you this story? It's a wonderful one. It's a wonderful story. He said, I want to prove God exists mathematically. I'm like, let's do it. Sounds awesome. I think she does, but let's go ahead and do it. So he sat down. He's like, what's the chance that a human being could walk on water? I'm like, oh, I don't know. Lizards can do it. Was that basilisk lizard that could walk on water? Let's say 1 in a billion. He's like, okay, 1 in a billion. So you're right down 1 in a billion. What's the chance that human being could change water into wine? I'm like, oh, I'm sure there's some backwoods alchemist in Switzerland that's figured it out. Let's say it's 1 in a billion. 1 in a billion. What's the chance? What's another miracle that was attributed to Jesus?
Raising the dead.
Raising the dead. Yes, raising the dead and healing the blind. Okay, so we contribute a probability to each of those. Chance of raising the dead. I'm sure there's some crazy scientist that has reinvigorated tissue. 1 in a billion. Curing the blind. That's probably more common, I would imagine, with surgery advances, right? So let's call that 1 in a million versus 1 in a billion. And he's loving this. He's writing these numbers down. I'm like, what are you doing with those numbers? He's like, well, the chance of one person being able to do all those things is therefore the product of all those probabilities. 1 in a billion times 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 1 in a million, which ends up being like 1 in like trillion, 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 which is essentially 0. So there's no chance a person could do it, which means a deity might do it. And I'm like, settle down, my friend. Settle down. Let's talk about why that's wrong. And I said, you're ignoring the fact that there's a conditionality in those events. You can't prove to me that walking on water is independent of changing water into wine, is independent of curing the sick, is independent of curing the blind, is independent of raising from the dead. You can't prove to me that independence. He's like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, prove to me they're independent. Show me statistically that those are independent events. He's like, I can't. I'm like, that's right. That means your whole argument is BS. You can't multiply those probabilities unless they're independent from each other. You see what I'm getting at here? His whole argument folded under the mathematics. Now, it seems silly to talk about God like that, but this same thing happens in court about once every 10 years. Some lawyer gets up, well, the probability of this, and this, and this, and this, and multiplies them all together and ignores the fact that they might not be independent. It happened about 10 years ago in LA when a lady got her purse snatched in LA, but it's longer than 10 years ago now. It's probably more like 20 years. Got her purse snatched in LA by a woman with a blonde ponytail who then jumped into a red convertible driven by an African-American man and sped off down a certain side street. And the lawyer prosecuting the case found a woman with a blonde ponytail dating an African-American man who owned a red convertible in LA. And so we found him. And the judge's like, how do you know you found him? He's like, well, the probability of a woman being blonde in LA, and I'm like, it's like, what, 1 in 1? He's like, so he said it was 1 in 2. Let's say it's 1 in 2. The chance she wears her hair in a ponytail is 1 in 100, because apparently out of a random sample, every 100 women, 1 of every 100 had a ponytail. Chance of a red convertible in LA is 1 in blah, 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 blah. Chance of an African-American male in LA is 1 in 5, or 1 in 6, or something like that. So the chance of all these things simultaneously happening together is 1/6 times 1/100th times this, times this, times this, which ends up being like 1 in a billion. So there's a 1 in a billion chance that you see the point? Well, and the prosecuting, or the defense attorney goes, wait a minute, did you ever look at the correlation between a blonde woman and a ponytail? The prosecuting lawyer's like, what correlation? He's like, well, if you actually look at your data, most of your blonde women have ponytails, or wear their hair on ponytails more than they don't. So therefore, you can't multiply those probabilities directly because they're not independent, they're dependent on each other. And there's an awful high percentage of African-American males that own red convertibles in LA. I don't know why, there were at that time. So once again, you can't multiply the probability of African-American male times convertible as independent when they're not necessarily independent. And once you take all those conditions and put them back in, it ends up being pretty common to find an African-American male dating a blonde ponytailed woman driving a red car in LA. So the defense attorney goes, so your 1 in a billion is more like 1 in 10. So why don't you go back out and find somebody else that matches the description even better? And the case got thrown out. And it was genius. I mean, it's genius because you can't assume things are independent. When we have more time in this course, which we never do, there's a test for independence that allows you to test whether or not things are independent. It's actually a pretty fun statistical test. If you ever need to do it, come find me. We'll do it together. But, I mean, it's the kind of thing you can't assume independence. These things are not independent. And we don't have to do a test to figure it out. We know they're not independent because the commercial is placed after the show. We had that discussion in class, right? You don't put any old commercial after any old show. They tailor those things very carefully to be in theme or in tone or in volume with the shows. You don't want to have a story about the London Philharmonic Orchestra followed by a paintball ad. Generally, that's not going to be the audience you're targeting, right? So you're going to have this. There's a link this way, not this way, but this way. Is that cool? Okay, good. So we got that established. So you do have two data sets, but the trick is this is still a single t-test. So how are we going to deal with that? Well, let's start by entering this data, if you would, into your TIs. We're going to need the TIs to crunch the data for us. Go L1, L2, shows and commercials, okay? L1, L2, shows and commercials. I'll swing